Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining JINSA for this webinar on the somber second anniversary of the horrific October 7th attacks, reflecting on where we are, how we got here, and what still remains to be done. I'm Blaise Mishtal, JINSA's Vice President for Policy, and honored to be joined by an all-star lineup, headlined, of course, by our President and CEO, Dr. Mike Makovsky, John Hanna, the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow here at JINSA, and of course Ambassador Elliot Abrams, former U.S. Special Envoy for Iran and a member of JINSA's Iran Policy Project. Thank you all for being with us. I wanted to start by maybe asking, I know hindsight is 2020, and October 7th was such a tumultuous day. It's maybe hard to put ourselves back in the mindset of that day. But if you were to have thought on October 7th, where things would be in 2 years, how things would have progressed over 2 years, compared to where we are today, where did you think we would be and compared to where we are, and what sort of has surprised you about the last 2 years? Ambassador Abrams, maybe I could start with you.
Okay. I think most Israelis would have believed, and I thought the war would be over. I did not think this would be a 2-year war, and it could be a more than 2-year war in Gaza. I think also that Israel's regional situation is better than I would have anticipated. That is, the destruction of Hezbollah, essentially destruction of Hezbollah and of the Iranian nuclear program with the cooperation of the United States. I think the regional situation is better. I would also, I think, not have anticipated that what I might call the diplomatic situation would be as bad as it is. The recognition of the state of Palestine, the non-existent state of Palestine by so many new countries, and the outbreaks of anti-Semitism. I would not have anticipated that would be so bad.
Mike, any other surprises to raise?
Elliot took most of my answers, but but I'll just add one because I agree with everything he said. I would just add just a little more granularity. As Elliot said, we didn't think the war would go on this long, and it might go on longer. I'll just remind the audience, and I know Elliot, John, and we all, when we went to Israel, or when I first went after October 7th, which was in early November, I was told that the major operations in Gaza would be over by the end of December. Then when I was there in December with John and Elliot, we were told, to correct me if I'm wrong, that it would be over, major operations in Gaza would be over by the end of mostly January. And there was a general, who was a friend of ours that we met with, who was more of an outlier and said March of 2024, just to remind everyone. That's how much I think that they had. So not only was the October 7th a surprise for all sorts of reasons, and they didn't have clearly didn't have a plan of how to respond to this. There was no viable plan of attack that was prepared, which was also a surprise, I may add, which is, I think, one of the reasons they waited till the end of October to start the ground operations, one of the reasons. But anyway, they underestimated why it would take so long, and some of it's understandable. But let me just add, but some of it isn't. And then I would just add on the success. I think we all still thought. Well, I shouldn't speak for everybody. I'll just speak for myself. I didn't think Lebanon would go so well so fast. Obviously, I didn't predict Assad falling, and I did think eventually I'd have to go to Iran, and we had an idea of when that was going to happen roughly, but I didn't think that war would go as well. But let me just add one substantive point in addition that Elliot mentioned, and that has to do with Qatar. I really thought, and Blaise, you and I wrote an op-ed, I think in the New York Post, that came out I think like 5 days or 4 or 5 days after October 7th. And I think one of our arguments was you got to put pressure on the Iranians and you got to put pressure on the Qataris if you want to try to get the hostages out. And maybe we overestimated Iranian influence. I don't know, but I never really felt until perhaps in the last week or two, or the last few weeks, that the proposition of pressuring the Qataris was really tested. You don't know counterfactually what would have happened, but I knew that the Biden administration, I think we thought, was not going to pressure the Iranians, but that Biden, and then now you have a Trump administration, and I really thought there'd be a lot more. The U.S. would come down a lot harder on the Qataris. It might not have succeeded, but I just don't see a lot of evidence of that, and that's been a big surprise.
John, anything that hasn't been covered yet that surprised you in the last 2 years?
If you put it that way, then I've got nothing to say. But just to foot stomp the point. I mean, I remember appearing on a webinar that Mike moderated on October the 9th that morning, and I was pessimistic. I thought this would be one of Israel's longest wars. I probably gave it a couple of months it would last, because both Elliot and I have been involved in much shorter wars than that, in which the United States and the international community came down very quickly like a ton of bricks on Israel when you started to see mounting civilian casualties. And the thought that we would be here 2 years now with Israel sustaining this effort is a huge surprise to me. And while the U.S.-Israel relationship has had some real stresses and strains over the past 2 years, for the most part, it's survived, and Israel's gotten a lot of the weapons it needs, with a few exceptions, and it's gotten the American diplomatic cover it needed to continue this struggle, despite a huge and very costly international backlash against Israel. So I guess I'm surprised that the IDF had as much trouble as it had with this bunch of kind of B-League terrorists in Gaza, in Hamas. It's been a much more difficult and problematic struggle for some good reasons, having to do with the hostages and the tunnels and all of those things, but also I think for some other reasons that have to do with the way the war was fought. So surprised by that problem, but also surprised, frankly, by this extraordinary, unbelievable military success everywhere else in the region that I think in the end will be the lasting strategic impact of October 7th, how Israel, in the space of maybe 18 months, came down from the lowest point in its history to, kind of rising again, reestablishing Israeli deterrence and dominance militarily, intelligence-wise, across the entire Middle East against not only its most dangerous foes for the last several decades, but America's most dangerous foes as well. The military and intelligence prowess has just been absolutely phenomenal. The one other thing I'd say, I guess I was sort of surprised by. I mean, Mike said we were there in Israel in December. Elliot and I again were there in January. We were there to try and figure out, what does the day after in Gaza look like? How do we deal with the strategic problem of humanitarian assistance, which we knew would grow with time? It had been an issue in Israel's past conflicts, and we thought we needed a plan to deal with that, to ensure that Israel would have the time and space to continue the fight against Hamas, even as Gazan civilians were being dealt with on the humanitarian side, and to begin figuring out how do you, even while you're fighting, begin to build some kind of political alternative that other Gazans might be able to be attracted to, and that could possibly get the buy-in, particularly of the Arab states, but others in the international community. The inability of the United States and Israel to get together for a variety of reasons, on some kind of common strategy to fill that void and that vacuum of what are we working toward? What does Gaza look like in the day after? How do we combine a military strategy with a political strategy to undermine and defeat Hamas? I was a little bit obviously surprised, since I spent many months working on a day after project with Israel and Mike, that we weren't able, between Washington and Jerusalem, to come up with some kind of coherent idea that we could sell internationally.
On that score, I think our colleague in Israel, retired IDF Major General Yaakov Amidror, has proven right when he relentlessly says it's not yet the day after. But I guess two things that I was surprised none of you seem to have mentioned. One is on U.S. policy. Is there no aspects of U.S. policy that have surprised you over the course of the last 2 years, whether it's the highs of President Trump joining in with Operation Midnight Hammer and joining the Israeli campaign against Iran, or the lows of the arms embargoes at the ends of the Biden administration? And then secondly, sort of the massive spike in global anti-Semitism. I have to say, having here at JINSA written on past conflicts in Gaza, obviously the success of Hamas propaganda in terms of the numbers of civilians killed and their ability to sort of control the narrative of the conflict isn't surprising. But that we now have kids on U.S. college campuses saying, we're going to celebrate our martyrs to mark October 7th, and sort of evincing not just support for the Hamas narrative of what's happening on the ground, but actually support for Hamas itself. I don't know, maybe I was naive, but that still seemed unthinkable to me on October 7th. But would be curious for your thoughts on that, Ambassador.
There was a possibility always of U.S. support declining, but I wouldn't say I'm surprised that Joe Biden, who'd always been very pro-Israel, remained pretty much pro-Israel. Yes, there were times when he was persuaded by his staff to withhold certain weapons for a while, but fundamentally stood with the Israelis. With Trump, one has to remember, again, I'm not saying that this was an obvious prediction, but when he came down the escalator in 2016, in that opening statement, he talked about the Iranian nuclear program. So was it shocking that after Israel's success, he went in and took out the remnants of that program? I would say not shocking, gratifying, but not shocking. On the other part of your statement, I agree with you. I mean, I think it was John who said, we always thought, Israel couldn't go beyond a 2-week war, 3-week war, 4 weeks at the outside before the diplomatic pressure forced it to stop. That didn't happen. But what did happen was this amazing outburst of anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, Australia, Canada, the United States. I certainly didn't predict that. We can analyze the reasons for it, and we're all using the word anti-Semitism, and it's the right word. It's not anti-Zionism. It's not criticism of Israel. It's anti-Semitism, and that in retrospect, we can say, well, if a 4-week war was going to be a problem for Israel, not only diplomatically but in public opinion terms, what could a 100-week war be? Well, it's nevertheless, I think, a real problem. It's a problem in the United States. I think it's a calamity in some other places like France and England for those Jewish populations.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I just, Mike, if you want to get in on this point, go ahead.
Well, no, just on the anti-Semitism, I'll say, I guess like Elliot, I was very surprised Jews get massacred, and there's a surge of support for the killers, and a lot of just an unbelievable spike, as we saw the other day, still playing out in Manchester. But it made me realize something I hadn't thought about enough, something that Elliot has written about or said, or both, that I think there, and Elliot, correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but I don't think, and he wrote a book about this. um, you're, I don't think there's a lot we could do. I'm talking about the American Jewish community about anti-Semitism. Uh, we have what Jews need to do is make sure our children learn about Judaism and that they're proud to be Jewish. And I think that's where we should be putting efforts. There's so much money that has gone into fighting anti-Semitism, and I think that if you want to fight anti-Semitism, you should make sure to send your kids to Jewish day school and Israel. And as Elliot has also mentioned, the summer camps, which is something that I don't really think about as much. But I agree, and I would add that, and I encourage you to read his book about discussing this kind of stuff. But I would also add that but I'd say that about the American Jewish community because I do give a tremendous amount of credit, and I don't think they get enough, which is the Trump administration's activities against these universities. They've made it clear that they won't tolerate anti-Semitism. They've shown there's a cost to mistreating Jewish students. They've been able to do it in a way that it's hard for a non-government entity to really do. And I give it now. Some might say they have mixed other motives, not just anti-Semitism, whatever it is. It's clearly something that they have stigmatized. They've shown there's a cause. I think what the administration has done on this is worth almost more than hundreds of millions of dollars that have been poured into anti-Semitism on the, confronting it. And I give them a lot of credit for it. And on the flip side, something I was also surprised maybe. I really thought the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, and I'm talking about the Biden administration, would have talked about anti-Semitism more, that they would stigmatize it far more than they did because they hardly did it at all. And I didn't see a lot of politicians. You saw some Democrats do it, and you obviously saw Republicans. But I really was disappointed until the Trump administration came in that there wasn't a bigger federal effort to confront a scourge that has really been an unbelievable stain on America. And because I never thought I'd see such a thing. And I give the administration credit that they're confronting what I think too many people were complacent about, and I include myself in that. But I really was extremely disappointed in the Biden administration, how they just seem to tolerate it and say almost nothing. But I do give credit to the Trump administration for doing something. But it's not a partisan statement; it's just fact. And I would have expected more from Biden because he's not an anti-Semite at all, and I don't think Harris is either. But they just didn't want to talk about it.
It's just taking a slightly different direction, but one thing that I don't know how surprised I was, but it was a pleasant outcome of this. Having relatively low expectations about how the Arab states would have responded to a 2-year war, the most brutal war ever against Palestinians. You had, 5 or 6 Arab states in some level of peace agreements and normalization agreements with Israel. All of them complained. All of them got behind talk about genocide. It was kind of standard issue stuff that you would have always expected from the Arabs. But the fact that in particular the Abraham Accords countries held as well as they did, stuck to their guns. Some of them, particularly the Emiratis, got involved, engaged in Gaza on the humanitarian front, even while the Israelis were fighting. And in that huge moment in April of 2024, when we finally first time crossed the threshold of a direct Iranian massive projectile attack against Israel, you actually had a number of Arab states standing up and participating and joining and putting some of their own assets into the mix. At the crunch moment when Israel was, they knew, it was obvious, it was Israel that was under attack in the middle of this war with the Palestinians by Iran, and some of these Arab states, including ones not yet normal with Israel, actually stood up and were accounted for on the right side of the equation, which has been a positive thing. And I think, well, once we get past Gaza and are able to begin to put this in the rearview mirror. I think people will be so relieved, and hopefully there will be a degree of cooperation between Israel, the Arab states, and the United States, and moving to something better. That I'm, reasonably optimistic that the door remains open to a pretty significant push again on Israel's relations with the broader Arab and Muslim world.
One thing I would like to add, we've talked about Israel's military achievements. Obviously, October 7th was a systemic failure, but since then there have been incredible achievements. But I wonder if it's fair to say that those incredible achievements have been those of the intelligence community, Mossad essentially, and the Air Force, not the Army in Gaza. And this has, I think, occasioned a debate in Israel about what has happened to the Army over the last 10 or 20 years. Moved from being ready to fight a ground war to fighting terrorism, the diminution in size of the standing army, the debate now about whether the standing army has to be larger. I think one of the things that's happened in these 2 years is the opening of a discussion and debate about the tactics, and it's more than tactics, the whole strategy that was adopted by the Israeli land forces for how they were going to build themselves, and whether that turned out to be a mistake.
Yeah, so I think you just very successfully preempted my next question, Ambassador, for which I thank you, which is that, focusing on the war since October 7th, all three of you have basically described, to be Dickensian about it, a tale of two wars, right? It was the best of wars regionally, and it's the worst of wars in Gaza. And what do you ascribe that to, or how can we hold in our minds these two very different outcomes, or sort of operations that Israel has launched, the extreme success against Hezbollah and Iran, and the fact that Gaza is still dragging on. Is it as simple as underinvestment in the ground forces? Is there more to this story? I don't know, John, do you have thoughts?
Well, I mean, my thought at the sort of most basic, highest level is that you get what you pay for, and Israel invested the last 20 to 40 years in the Iranian challenge, in understanding it at a granular level, how they would attack, constantly refining, constantly seeing that as the biggest threat, together with the obvious Hezbollah threat on the northern border. How do you deal with those, neutralize those when it was a matter of, when the fight comes, not if it would come. And they invested over the course of decades, both on the intelligence side and on the capability side of what it would take to get that job done. And I think in Gaza, it was just a basic kind of, failure to focus and to invest, and to the thought that, what we hear from some Israeli colleagues, that the Shin Bet, the intelligence, didn't have a single live human source inside of Hamas, despite the fact you had thousands of Gazans going back and forth across that border into Israel every day, going to hospitals, going to work inside of Israel. And instead, Hamas was able to turn some of those workers against Israel, rather than vice versa, in terms of Israel understanding fundamentally how Hamas was thinking, operating, planning. The fact that Israel was surprised by the fact they had something like 400 miles of terror tunnels, some of them built to, extraordinary depths of 200 feet. This terror kingdom underground was somehow a surprise and a shock to Israel. And this is a place directly on their border where they've sent their citizens to populate virtually every last inch right up to the border, controlled by this terrorist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. So the underinvestment in dealing with Hamas, understanding Hamas, having plans that were constantly being redeveloped on how you were going to destroy and defeat Hamas and essentially eradicate it and take over Gaza was, at the most basic level, I think the fundamental problem.
Yeah. Please.
Mike,
Oh,
Mike, yeah.
no, I agree with John. I would add, look, based on what we know, and there's going to have to be, you hope there's a thorough inquiry. There've been, I think the IDF has done some, but there hasn't been a national inquiry in Israel about this. So we don't know everything, but based on what we know, as John pointed out, certainly the intelligence, they didn't know, but it also went up. You could argue they knew, and there were enough inclinations, but they didn't, draw the appropriate conclusions because they had a fixed idea. They also thought that it was always seen as a secondary, even maybe a tertiary theater for them. And, Iran, Hezbollah, / Lebanon, those were the two main things. And, they thought they had the South settled. They had the Iron Dome protecting them roughly from the missiles. They had this anti-tunnel sensors and things like that in the ground, so they didn't worry about a invasion through the tunnels. And they had this expensive fence that they installed with technology that thought, okay, so that thing is settled. We don't have to think about it enough. I guess, one thing I haven't really reconciled, and hopefully we'll learn, is despite the fact that they didn't think about that, someone I know a long time who's involved with Jinsa, a supporter who runs a commodity trading company, told me, his job is to manage risk. And you always have to think about, I think what they call tail risk, things that are a lower probability, but also could have significant implications. And yet, even if they thought it was a low probability event, they still didn't do enough, it seems like, to protect that border. And that's surprising. And the last thing, maybe that answers more your question, is they just weren't ready what to do on, I don't want to use the day after, not what the governing day after. They just didn't have a plan of what to do if there was going to be a war. As John said, they've been planning about Hezbollah for a long time. They were planning Iran, and even on that, they had to adjust the Iran strategy based on recent developments, like the fact that there was no Assad regime, the fact that they didn't have to worry about Hezbollah retaliation. So then they expanded how they thought about what they could do in Iran, but they weren't really thinking about a war in Gaza. So that also I think, had a big impact.
So I guess in light of that, I wanted to ask all of you where we are in the war in Gaza now, 2 years on. President Trump has put forward his 20-point plan. I guess Hamas has given an answer or answered. I don't know if it's given an answer. But where do we think this goes from here? Ambassador Abrams, you wrote about this recently in the Free Press, which
Yes.
I think directly led to the decision for the Free Press to be bought for $150 million. It's
Well, I have to say,
correlation must be causation there.
That's why Elliot's dressed so well today. He's the beneficiary.
that will be an interesting thing to watch, including really being serious over the next 6 months, say, the coverage of Israel, which has been at best tendentious over the last 2 years, as it has been for NBC and CNN and all of them. Where are we now? Let me just apologize for the background noise, which is street being repaired. Where are we now? I think we'll know a lot better by the weekend. The president put forward a plan, and he said he wanted it to get done by Sunday night. This is now Monday, and nothing's happened. And now he said, well, it'll be a few more days. The essence of the plan is the Israelis pull back in exchange for getting their hostages out. That has not happened. And instead, what Hamas is doing is obviously trying to stretch it out and negotiate a better deal. Will Egypt and Qatar be able to force Hamas into greater compromises. Again, we're going to find out in a few days. The Egyptians and Qataris may be talking to the wrong Gazans. That is, they're talking to the guys who live in the Four Seasons Hotel, in Qatar, not the guys on the ground who are actually commanding forces now. I do think the Qataris are under pressure from the president, because my own view is after the Israeli attack on Hamas in Qatar, in Doha, the Qataris went running to the president to say, defend us, defend us. And the president did. He issued that executive order saying, we're going to defend Qatar. But I think he exacted a price, which was deliver Hamas. I want a deal. I want to bring the war to an end. Well, the deal is there on paper, the 20 points. And every, government has said we agree. And Hamas has said a kind of yes, but. And I think the coming days will determine whether this really begins with the exchange of Israeli hostages for convicted Palestinian terrorists, or is this going to be dragging on? In which case, the president has said, and I think he will do what he said. He'll say to the Israelis, "You have no choice but to keep on fighting, and we will back you up." I think we can say what the people of Gaza want at this point. They want the war to come to an end, but that may not be what what's left of the high command of Hamas want. They may want to just keep on fighting, whatever the Egyptians or Qataris or Gazans say.
John, maybe just to put the same question to you differently or follow up on it. As Ambassador Abrams said, maybe we've been talking to the wrong Gazans. But if we do have this split between Doha and Gaza Hamas leadership, is there anything more the U.S. can do in terms of putting pressure on Hamas, the Hamas that we can reach, to make a deal happen? At previous instances, President Trump has said there would be hell to pay if there wasn't a deal. Is the U.S. capable of making Hamas pay hell, or is the most that we can do to let Israel keep doing what it has been doing up until now?
Yeah, it's a very good question because, as you say, if I had $100 every time the president said there would be hell to pay for Hamas, I'd have a reasonable night out and dinner with a good bottle of wine. So I'm not sure there's much he can do. He can hold that threat that Elliot mentioned of basically green lighting, a resumption of an all-out Israeli military offensive into Gaza City, maybe eventually into the central camps to conquer all 100% of Gaza. But I think it's kind of looked and discussed. There's a point 17 in this plan that basically says Hamas won't have a veto over this process. If for whatever reason they end up endlessly delaying or rescinding any acceptance of the deal, it doesn't stop the plan from going forward in parts of Gaza where the IDF is in control and can begin handing off to the elements of the plan in terms of a new apolitical technocratic Palestinian committee that would run day-to-day affairs in liberated sections of Gaza, bringing in, the Board of Peace that President Trump and Tony Blair will be in charge of, distributing money and funds and overseeing the day-to-day governance. And then, of course, this so-called international stabilization force, presumably primarily made up of Arabs, that would come in together with some trained up new Palestinian police from Gaza to try and effectively impose law and order and protect the borders, Israel's border with Gaza, and maybe the border with Egypt as well. I think the more you can do, even with the IDF in place, if the Arabs really now have decided enough is enough, we're prepared for the first time in history to really take onto our shoulders responsibility for the fate of the Palestinians, because they've proven time and time again they're incapable of doing anything constructive for themselves. if they've decided now we're prepared to really put not only political, diplomatic, economic skin into this game, but on the security front as well, to come in and start building this alternative, not allow Hamas to have a veto and allow the Israelis to keep putting pressure on them to implement this point 17 of the Trump plan that says we go forward with or without Hamas, that would be a huge deal. I have to say I'm skeptical and a bit pessimistic that the Arabs are prepared to do that while the IDF continues military operations. But I do think that's a point of that the U.S. has briefed to the Arab states, and hopefully they've assented to, and there might be some ability to pressure that and move forward, even if Hamas doesn't want to move forward.
Maybe digging a little deeper on this, we have a question from Laura Kelly with The Hill, and she's asking what the main sticking points of the negotiations in Egypt are and what has brought Hamas to the table right now. Ambassador Abrams, do you have any insights to offer?
What's brought them to the table, I think, is this combination of pressure from Qatar, Egypt, and really, if you look at that, the so-called New York Declaration from the whole Arab League, which is really saying now, stop the war. And the war is going badly for Hamas. Their losses are very large, and they presumably want to stop those losses. And they must have some sense of public opinion in Gaza and the loss of popularity. So I think, they feel it, but they're fighting for survival. And that means that they don't, for example, want to lay down their arms. They don't want to give up more territory. They don't want to give up a place in Palestinian politics. It's interesting to me that their stated position is, yeah, there can be a technocratic government that can come in and rebuild Gaza, that's fine. But all of these decisions have to be made, according to Hamas, by all the Palestinian organizations together, presumably under some kind of umbrella like PLO that they've always been trying to get into. They want to survive politically and they want to survive militarily.
Mike or John, anything to add on the negotiations?
No,
Sticking with that.
Other than I would say on the hostages, I still have to be convinced that Hamas is not going to try and demand a much greater Israeli withdrawal. They talk about where we're ready to go forward with the first phase, a hostage release, prisoners released, some level of Israeli withdrawal, but they talk about the appropriate field conditions and all of that. I think they're angling for a much bigger Israeli withdrawal. But if the president is able to get all of those hostages out, able to get Hamas to surrender all of their leverage, even without, in the absence of a full Israeli withdrawal, that would be a huge development and achievement that I certainly wouldn't have seen coming.
Mike, yeah, I had a question, but if you want to add anything on that.
Go ahead, ask your question first.
Sure. Well, I was going to ask, harkening back to the op-ed from the days right after October 7th that you mentioned, if in fact the Israeli strike in Doha did have some sort of salutary effect in terms of putting pressure on Qatar to pressure the Hamas leaders that they have access to agree to this deal, and yet we're sort of stuck. Hamas is negotiating and trying to draw out the clock. Is there more pressure that could be put on Qatar to try to move things forward? And in light of what we saw last week with the apology that Bibi had to give to the Qataris, and then the sort of the broad security guarantee for the Qataris that President Trump issued last week, do we think the U.S. would actually put that pressure on Doha now?
I don't think they will, but they should. We don't know if it will work. But they should they could do more for sure. I mean, I wouldn't have done that executive order, which is rather odd that it came out about some security guarantee. I'd rather that was withdrawn already. I'd rather We started moving our military assets out of El Udeid, the military base in Qatar, which, you know, our colleague General Frank McKenzie, previous CENTCOM commander, wrote about last year, a year ago, saying, you know, in the conflict with Iran, it's going to be a vulnerability, which it obviously was. The Iranians attacked it. They may have given heads up. We withdrew almost like 99.9% of our forces from there. We moved all planes from there. It was no value whatsoever. It was actually a liability. I'm not saying we should withdraw completely from there, but I think actually withdrawing our forces from there, which we should do anyway, uh, uh, because you know, I think because the conflict with Iran isn't over yet, which we should also get to. Um, so I think that we could do. We could try to push the Qataris to kick out the Hamas leaders there. We should push the Turks to do the same with the Hamas leaders that are in that country. Whether we will help or not, because the folks in Gaza, the Hamas, when I say the folks, I mean the Hamas leaders, such as they are in Gaza, aren't going to listen to those people in Turkey or Qatar. Maybe not, but we should do it and see if it would help. I wish we had done it a long time ago, but I think those are things I would certainly do. I think if you made it clear to the Qataris that our relationship with them really helps depend on this and their ability to get this done. Again, I don't know if it will succeed, but you could try to squeeze more because, look, it's time to really end this war, and I think all the stops. And by the way, it's not just Qatar; it's also Turkey. Although I don't think they'll have as much influence, but it will help. I think kind of at a minimum getting the Turks on board properly. And Erdogan has been such a supporter of Hamas over the years, but it will help signal to Hamas fighters how isolated they are right now.
Last round of questions, maybe, and then happy to open it up to the audience for any questions that you might have. Feel free to submit those using the Q&A function in Zoom. We had talked about at the outset the diplomatic isolation that Israel is suffering from now, and perhaps surprising 2 years later, or maybe not, given what we've seen in previous conflicts. Would this peace plan, if it goes forward, sort of help to end that, or are there things that President Trump can be doing to help end that beyond pushing this peace plan forward? How do we turn back the clock on that? I don't know, Ambassador Abrams, if you have any ideas.
I think it does, if not stop the momentum, it slows it down a lot. If there had been a peace a month ago, for example, these recognitions by the UK, Canada, Australia, France would probably not have happened. I think it makes it easier for those governments to push back on those elements of their electorate that are literally violently anti-Israel. So I think it helps. But if you look at the UK, for example, I mean, they have the Jewish community there is outnumbered something like 14-1 by the Muslim community. There's a lot of anti-Semitism. There's a lot of anti-Israel protests, and all of that is within the Labour Party. So it would make it possible for the British government, for the Prime Minister to push back a little bit more easily, but it certainly doesn't solve the underlying problem of anti-Semitism in British politics. And I say that the same in other countries, France, Canada, Australia, but it would slow it down.
John, would you expect some of these countries to walk back? I mean, maybe not the recognition of the Palestinian state, but the embargoes that European countries have now put on Israeli weapons. Would you expect them to lift those if there is a peace plan, or is that something that you'd have to have the U.S. browbeat them about to sort of bring relations back to some level of normalcy?
Yeah, I think you'd certainly have to prioritize it and have U.S. backing to really work for it. Although I think you've got a good case. I think there's going to be such enormous relief if and when the killing actually stops here, and we have a ceasefire, we have an end to the war, we have Israel, the United States, these Arab states and stakeholders, together with some Europeans, really working together to try and push towards some kind of better day after in Gaza, potentially, again, restarting some kind of discussion between Israelis and Palestinians, with Arab backing for what the future might look like, and in the context of obviously some kind of big push on Israel's deeper and further integration into the region, getting that normalization train back up and running, and particularly with the Saudis. But it doesn't seem to me it was an accident. You've got Indonesians, the Pakistanis at that meeting in New York with President Trump when he unveiled this plan a couple of weeks ago. So I do think, you can imagine if things, God willing, are able to somehow move forward in a positive trajectory on this plan, 6 months to a year, we're talking about a quite different kind of environment and region and ecosystem in which Israel's relations, certainly within its neighborhood, even the situation of the average Palestinian in Gaza, and then hopefully Israel's relations with the broader world with a big American push and sponsorship, I think could be looking at a much improved situation. And that's certainly what I'd be working for.
Mike, pivoting a little bit, we talked about the spectacular success that Israel had with Operation Rising Lion against Iran. But as we wrote in a paper right after that campaign ended, it's not over yet. And so, we're talking about Gaza, but what's needed to keep the focus on Iran and make sure it doesn't rebuild and that we don't end up at October 7th all over again? What do we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah. Look, I think while President Trump is president, I have confidence that I think he's invested. He's fully invested in that Iran will not, uh, make a lot of progress towards a nuclear weapon, and he would, at least if he wouldn't get involved. If Iran tried to do something reckless on that front, at a minimum, I'm sure he would support Israel from doing something, and maybe even use U.S. force again. So, I think I think on the nuclear front, uh, we want to be very vigilant that they don't do anything. Clearly, it seems like the Iranians, they don't think this war is over. They clearly want vengeance. I mean, they were so phenomenally humiliated. I mean, it's hard to imagine how much they were humiliated. That just after what, less than within 48 hours, Israel had a complete air supremacy, which meant for 10 days they just flew over a lot of the Iran airspace at will. And it's an unbelievable humiliation for this Iranian leadership, those that are still living after this war. So I think the Iranians are not finished on the nuclear front. They're going to want to try to rebuild. I think the U.S., at least for the next few years, will stay vigilant. But where I think is we need to pivot, is to this is a very vulnerable regime now. It was vulnerable before the war, before June. Uh, a country that has one of the highest natural gas reserves in the world cannot even provide electricity to their people and so on like that, sufficiently. Um, they've arrested thousands of people after this war because they're seeing spies everywhere, and they're paranoid by nature, this regime. This is a weak regime. And I think what we need to do is, and I would hope the U.S. would do, is, and Israel needs to help the U.S. and other countries focus like this. You really got to squeeze this regime, unfortunately, and really try to keep the pressure up, and try to do what you can to undercut the regime, to increase the odds that the Iranian people will rise up and bring it down. No one knows what triggers revolutions. You don't know what might do it or when. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 20 years. You don't know. But I think what U.S. policy has to be is to really keep the pressure on this regime, because they're going to try to restore. Maybe they'll try to wait out Trump, and then they'll try to build up their program after that. But whatever it is, I think the Iranian regime is on their back foot, and the ultimate solution for the nuclear threat of Iran is a collapse of this regime.
Anything to add on that, John or Ambassador Abrams, on where we go next on Iran?
No, I just, I need to apologize and jump off. I've got to get physically to another place for another,
Wait, Elliot, before you get off, did I characterize your book correctly, if I may ask?
yeah, I would say very, very quickly, it's called If You Will It. It makes an argument that, as you said, the main thing Jews can do is strengthen their own community, strengthen Jewish identity, strengthen the tie for Israel. For the United States as a country, for American society, the thing to do is to enforce existing laws, regulations, and rules, something that wasn't being done, particularly the rules on college campuses. And I join you in what you said about the Trump administration in insisting that colleges enforce the rules that are on the books about how the university is run, about what's permitted and what isn't permitted, about how students need to treat each other.
Yeah. By the way, Blaze, if I could add, I put the onus on the left and I criticize the Biden administration, but I do think what we have seen, certainly in the last year, is a rising anti-Semitism also on the far right. And I think it's incumbent on Republican leaders to ostracize those folks that are platforming or spreading that are anti-Semitism. Tucker Carlson is the obvious place you could start. And I think that could only come from, respected Republican leaders to do so.
I'm going to jump off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Abrams. With just a couple of minutes left, Mike and John, I'll maybe put you on the spot and ask you for your best predictions on when we do this webinar for the 3rd anniversary of 10/7, a year from now. Where are we going to find ourselves? John, any ideas?
Well, I mean, it obviously all depends. And, I think we've got, for the first time in 2 years, we've got an American president who's quite powerful, certainly powerful in this region with virtually all sides, the Arab side, as well as the Israeli side. And he's shown himself willing to use that pressure and leverage to advance a plan that he has put on the table, that he's going to be the chairman of the board, literally, of the Board of Peace, to implement this plan. It doesn't solve all your problems, but it goes a long, long way to have the president now invested and engaged. Question is, can he stay interested, engaged, invested, continuing to push all sides forward by sheer force of will toward implementing this plan? On the Arab side, I would also say this is something reasonably historic. You have this group of Arab states friendly to the United States, well disposed toward Israel and the things that Israel has accomplished in the broader region, now all agreed about the basic end state of this war, which is the hostages are returned and Hamas has no role to play inside of Gaza politically or militarily, and saying that they're prepared to put real skin in the game to get the Palestinians to a better day after here. Let's see if they're prepared to go with that. But that's an important development. And again, it creates possibility that we haven't had for a very long time, if ever, during this war so far, of an American, Arab-backed, Israeli agreed-to vision for how we're going to move forward. So I think the prospects for being in a much better place a year from now than we are today, whether or not Hamas ends up agreeing to all 20 points in this plan, I think are better than they've been at any point in this war.
Mike, do you share that optimism?
I do. I'm much more optimistic. I was even more optimistic a year ago and I'm even more optimistic today. You should never get too optimistic about the Middle East. I think obviously we all learned that lesson, but we should. John put it well, and I think the weakening. Look, the focus so much is Gaza, and it's important, very important for a lot of reasons, for Israeli society, for Palestinian lives, for Israel standing in the world, all sorts of things. But it's also, as John mentioned earlier in this webinar, that it could lead to other things. Hopefully, maybe if we could settle this, then there could be normalization with the Saudis. I think based on what the Indonesian leader said in New York, you could maybe see it there also and in other places. So I think there's a lot of good things that could come out of resolving the situation in Gaza. But the Iran issue, I think strategically remains the biggest issue still. The regime is still in power. They want vengeance. We can't get complacent about that at all. We have to enforce existing sanctions against the Iranians. And I think that will remain, I think a year from now, I think that will still likely remain probably the biggest strategic question. But Israel is, and I think the Israelis have learned, obviously, from October 7th, we conclude this way, that they can, complacency is an enemy. But I don't think the Israelis are going to be complacent by Iran, on Iran. I don't, are also our understandings of interactions with senior U.S. military folks like at CENTCOM. I don't think the U.S. military in the Middle East, the CENTCOM command, I don't think they're complacent either. I think what we do have to worry about here is in Washington, is that there isn't a complacency. Even if the Gaza situation is settled, even if you could turn to normalization, which I know we all hope, will happen, and I think will happen eventually, we still need to be very vigilant about that. And there are always other things that we still need to be worried about, such as I think the threat of Muslim Brotherhood in the region, and maybe a rise of Turkey more, and things like that. But we could discuss that in another webinar. But overall, I'm optimistic.
And the Houthis, Mike.
Yeah, the
Houthis
Houthis got to be
open
resolved.
account.
100%. And I think we're going to see the Israelis, no matter what happens with Gaza. I think that my expectation is that Israel is going to continue attacking the Houthis unless the United States says that they're going to take care of this. I think the Israelis are part of a long-term campaign. And if I may add one last thing on this, it would be useful for the U.S. officials not just not to be to be vigilant and not complacent about Iran, but we should really kind of think, and this is another conversation about what the last 2 years, particularly the last year, particularly June, what this says about Israel, what it says about Israel in the region, and how maybe what a valuable ally they could be, and they can maybe relieve our burden in the region as much. We need to continue to support them, but it could lead to also we could see a healthier, if there's a relationship between Israel and the United States. Not that the U.S. isn't very supportive, but I think we should think about Israel as a partner even more so than we thought before in the region, and maybe to lessen our burden a little bit. But I think there's a lot of good things that could be happening. So overall, I'm mostly optimistic.
Well, thank you, Mike and John, and thanks to Ambassador Abrams, even though he's no longer with us. I'm sure I speak for both of you when I say that there's no risk of JINSA being complacent. We remain vigilant as always. And I think one area that we didn't mention, but is going to be very critical for both Israel and the United States in the region, is Syria. And for all those of you in the audience, I would commend the paper the magnum opus really on Syria that John just released last week called Course Correction. You can find it on our website, jinsa.org, along with all of our other analysis on everything that has happened since October 7th. So thank you for joining in and looking forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.